and 9 chapters left, so our work is cut out for us, but we are ready to begin in chapter 42 tonight. We have seen a focus beginning in chapter 37 on Joseph, the son of Jacob, who has been mistreated by his brethren, sold into slavery. God was with him. Rose there and then was lied upon, wound up in prison. God was with him. And the improbable story, only made possible by the providence of God, is that Joseph went from a slave to being the right-hand man of the Pharaoh and the second most powerful man in Egypt. All of this surrounds a dream that was had about coming days of famine. Prepare now, 7 years of plenty, because 7 years of famine will follow. And through the interpretation of that dream that Pharaoh had, Joseph became a great savior of the world. And he was promoted and put in charge of preparing Egypt, and not just to save Egypt, but the region. Because, as chapter 41 reminds us, all the countries came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy corn, because the famine was so sore in all the lands. And then, chapter 42, among those who came were Joseph's family. Now, when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look one upon another? What are you waiting for?" And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there is corn in Egypt." We said this last time, of course, but the old translation, corn, might be better understood as grain, not corn as we know it. They didn't have that in Egypt at that time. But there's grain in Egypt. Get you down thither. Buy for us from thence, that we may live and not die. And so Joseph's 10 brethren went down. Why 10? Why not 11? Well, he explains. Verse 4, "But Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob sent not with his brethren, for he said, lest peradventure mischief befall him." The events that had taken place all those years before, some 20 plus years now, of Joseph's disappearance and his presumed death at the hands of some wild animal, had left its mark. Jacob had said, I'll go mourning to my grave, and I have no doubt that that was sincere. And he became rather obsessive about the safety of Benjamin. Last time I sent one of the sons of Rachel off with you all, he didn't come back. So anyway, so 10 of the sons will be heading to Egypt to buy food for the family. Now, verse 6 tells us that Joseph was the governor over the land, and he it was that sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. And Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them. Let me pause there. You know, one of the things that I probably hadn't thought enough about was the question of, did Joseph expect them to come? As far as I know, there's no revelation from God saying, now look, your family's going to be coming down here. Be ready for that. On the other hand, Joseph was a wise man, and he knew that if the whole region was suffering, if his family was still alive, they likely were going to come. But it still must have been something. Every day when he got up to look over the business, and now that day happens, and there are his brothers whom he recognized. They don't recognize him. Why would they not recognize him? Why would they recognize him? Been 20 years. He was 17 last time they saw him. And after all, where the last person you would expect to see ruling over Egypt would be the brother that they sold into slavery. They must have figured, well, I know he didn't die at the hand of some animal, at least not the way we fixed it up. But, 20 years in slavery, how long is a man going to last? So anyway, the last person they expected to see standing in that spot was Joseph, and they did not recognize him. He was called by a different name. Remember what Pharaoh called him? Anybody extra credit know the name? Pardon? Yeah. Zaphnath-Pahaniah, like you do. And spoke a different language. He looked different. People change a lot between 17 and 30 a lot of times. So anyway, here's the last thing they would have expected. So it's one-sided. He knows them. They don't know him. And he doesn't say, hey, let me tell you who I am. At least not yet. And I think the reason for that, and again, we draw this, based on the story, it's not specified so much, is that it was Joseph's wisdom to test these men. The last time he dealt with them, they weren't good people. They were treacherous and they were murderous. And so he speaks roughly to them in a strange language, speaks through interpreters. And verse 9 says that Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed. What dream did he dream? Bowed down to him. And what are they doing? They come and they bow down to him. But also, don't you think about when Joseph named his sons. He named his son Manasseh, his firstborn. What would the name Manasseh mean? Forgetting? Because God has made me to forget all this trouble, all the trouble back in my father's house. I don't think Joseph woke up every morning obsessing about that. Some people do. If something terrible happens to them, they can never get it that far from their mind. I think Joseph had come to terms with that. I think he was at peace with that. He had come through an awful lot, and God had blessed him here, and I don't think he obsessed about that. But it all came back to him when he saw these men. But I don't think there's anything malicious in what he does. Now, you can interpret it that way. Some do. I don't think you would, but I'm just saying, I think this is all purposeful. When we think about this story, don't we think about the providence of God? That's true. We also see the providence of Joseph, who's a man influenced by God. I think he's calculating here in his effort to try to find the right answers to some important questions. So how he approaches them is he accuses them of being spies. And they said, no, we're just here to buy food. He said, no, you're spies. You're here to spy out the land. No. They said, we're actually all brothers. They didn't look like brothers, did they? They were all born about the same time. It just looked like 10 guys. How in the world? You all look about the same age to me. So they realized that story might sound rather strange, but they said, no, we all have the same father. And in fact, there's more of us. There was one brother, and he's not. They didn't know they were talking to him. And there's another younger brother that hadn't left the father. Now, we find out later that actually those answers weren't just volunteered, that Joseph specifically asked, is your father still alive? Are there any others of you? So, and that'll come up in just a minute, but the point is, that they said, no. I know it looks suspicious, but I'm telling you, we are all family. Joseph said, no, you're spies. But I'll tell you what I'll do. You can prove to me that your story is true. Bring that youngest brother to me. You can see how things are working here and how that Joseph has a plan. And he said in verse 16, send one of you back home and bring him to me. And then I'll know you're not lying. Otherwise, you're just sunk. And then he puts him in prison for 3 days. 3 days. He have nothing about that prison, what was going on, what kind of talk was there. And then after 3 days, Joseph said, calls him back and he says, do this and live, for I fear God. They might have wondered what God, but he said, I fear God. And so he said, if you be true men, let one of your brethren be bound. Plan's changed, hasn't it? People sometimes ask the question, there's no answer to it given. Why did Joseph put them in prison for 3 days? Maybe he was just trying to work the plan out. But he decided, for whatever his reasons, maybe because it would just not be practical or kind to that family, his family, to have one guy try to take a bunch of food back and be vulnerable on the road. He doesn't tell us why. But he changes it around and he says, no. Now, all of you can go except one. One will stay behind to be a hostage, we might say, as far as they were concerned. And the rest of you can take food back. But bring that youngest son to me or you're not going to see my face again. No more dealing with you unless you prove that you're not spies. That's what they hear. And verse 21, isn't that telling? And they said one to another, verily we're guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon him. Maybe we know it by experience. We certainly have seen it. I tell you, that guilt will work on your mind, on your conscience, if you have a conscience. And there are people who will be maybe involved in some sort of meanness, some sort of sin, and then something happens at work and they wonder, is this God punishing me for what I did? You know, that guilt just shows up everywhere. It's just like a stench you can't get off of you. And you struggle with it. And so we can relate to this burden, this feeling of anguish and disquiet. And that's when Reuben speaks up and he says, I told you let that boy, we shouldn't do this. And all of this is going on. Now, they don't realize Joseph can hear them. They don't think he can understand them. He understands every word they're saying. As far as I know, this is the first time he knew about Reuben and his extra plan to try to free him. But when he heard all that, of course, it touched him deeply. And he went aside privately somewhere where they couldn't see him and wept about it. And then he came back dry-eyed. And he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. And then he commanded to fill their sacks with corn and also to restore their money, to put the money that they bought it with back in the sacks. They didn't know that. And laden the asses, the donkeys in verse 26 with corn and departed thence. Somebody made this point somewhere that I read, and I hadn't really thought about this. I'm not sure what to think about it now. But you know, back in chapter 31, when Jacob came into Canaan, you remember it talks there specifically about verse 17 of Genesis 31. Jacob rose up and set his sons and his wives upon camels. They came into this land on camels, but they came down to Egypt some years later on donkeys, which I'm told are a good bit less expensive. I guess they still are. I don't know if that suggests there's been some downturn in the family's fortunes or not. But anyway, be that as it may, they're on the way back home with food, but with one less brother. And somewhere along the way, you remember, one of them opens up their sack to get some food out for the animals and finds that his money's in there. And again, verse 28, and he said to his brethren, my money's been restored. And their heart failed. They didn't say, oh, great. They said, oh, this is terrible. They were just terrified of this man in Egypt and what can go wrong, and God is mad at us. What is this that God has done to us, they said. Again, that guilt works on the conscience, which just colors everything. That guilty conscience is hard to live with. There's no peace with the wicked, as Isaiah would say. So they come back to Jacob, and they told him everything that happened. How that the man that was in charge spoke roughly to us, took us as spies, and we explained, that we're 12 brethren. And he said, well, I'm not going to believe you until you bring that one back that you didn't bring with you this time. And they empty out their sacks, verse 35. And behold, it's not just one, everybody's got their money back. And now they're just afraid, they're terrified of all this. We got to take Benjamin with us. We've got to do that if we're going to get more. And Jacob says, no way. Verse 36, the father said, me ye have bereaved of my children. I find that interesting. Who does he say is responsible for this? They are. You have bereaved me. I don't know. What did he know? I don't know that he knew the whole story. I doubt he did. But he certainly got the idea. Last time I sent Joseph your way, he didn't come back. That's how much I trust you with this one. Will you take Benjamin away? And Reuben tries to step in and to say to his father, slay my two sons if I don't bring him back. But Jacob's not having it. He said, my son shall not go down with you. His brother is dead. He wasn't, but he thought he was. And he's left alone. And if mischief befall him by the way in which ye go, then shall you bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to the grave, to Sheol. I want you to notice too, and I'm sure you have in reading this, how that Jacob will say things like this. He is left alone. Well, in a sense, he was the last son of Rachel. But, that old idea of the favoritism, this is my favorite son, that never did go away, did it? It never did. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, the other seems like Jacob's never going to let them forget it, even if their own guilt would.
Yeah.
He brings it up everything, every little bit.
Well, this is his heart. This is it to him. This is the world to him. Joseph and Benjamin were, and that's just Benjamin. And so, they are his favorite people in the world, and one of them is gone, he thinks. So, chapter 43. Jacob boldly says, you're not going back with Benjamin. So we're at an impasse. But the problem is the food's running out every day. And I'm sure maybe what Jacob thought was, maybe this famine will be gone. After a while, maybe it'll be broken. He didn't know it was going to be 7 years. But the famine, chapter 43 begins, was sore in the land. If there was any hope of that, it was dashed. And it came to pass when he had eaten up the corn that they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, well, time to go, fellas, and get a little food for us. And they said, we've told you. Judah spoke up and said, the man solemnly promised us that we were not going to see his face again. He would not deal with us again unless we brought our brother, that is Benjamin. And he's not the kind of man to kid around about that. If you'll send our brother, we will go. If you won't, then we're not going to go. Because there's no way we're going to get help. We can't do business unless we take Benjamin. And Israel, of course, irritated by this. And he says, why'd you tell him you had a brother? And they said, the man straightly asked us. He asked us of our state. He asked us, is your father alive? He asked us, do you have another brother? We weren't going to lie to him. And that's when he said, bring him down. And then in verse 8, and this is a powerful moment, isn't it? Judah said to Israel, his father, he said, send the lad with me, and we will arise and go that we may live and not die, thou and our little ones. And I will be surety for him. Of my hand thou shalt require it. If I bring him not unto thee and set him before thee, then let me bear the blame forever. Except we had lingered, we'd been back by now. So Judah steps up. I think one of the things we learn from this great story is that these brothers had changed. They had done some awful things, but they had changed. The last time we saw Judah with any intensity, it was in that mess with Judah and Tamar in chapter 38. So that was an ugly picture here. But I think we find Judah stepping up here. And we'll see more of that as we go on. Well, Israel is back against the wall. He says, we got to do something or starve. So in verse 11, he says, if it must be so now, he says, then do this. Take a gift, some of the fruits of the land, unspecified, and a present of a little balm, some type of medicine mixture, and a little honey and spices and myrrh and nuts and almonds. Take a gift. Take double the money. It might have been an oversight, an accident, they put that money back. So take that money plus and take your brother. Verse 13. And go to the man. This is poignant, isn't it? Verse 14. Take your brother, arise, go again unto the man. God Almighty give you mercy before the man, that he may send away your other brother and Benjamin. And if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. I think this is, to me, sort of a picture of Jacob, in effect, saying, the Lord's will be done here. I've just put this in the hands of God. I pray he'll be merciful to us. His will be done. So, this is Genesis 43 and verse 15. The men took that present, and they took double the money, and they took Benjamin, and they rose and they went down to Egypt. And they stood before Joseph. And Joseph saw Benjamin. And he told the fellow who was the ruler, the overseer of his house, bring these men home. I want to meet them at my home. Change of venue. Which again, I'm not trying to read too much into the story, but don't you find that interesting? Again, I can't help but think this might be a part of a providential plan here. Joseph is thinking ahead. I think he's already decided, probably before they came back, if they come back, I'm going to test them in reference to Benjamin. We'll find that out in the next chapter. But all of that's based on, I think, largely them all coming into Joseph's home. Now, because again, they are guilt-ridden and paranoid, they are terrified by this. Verse 18 says they were afraid, that is, the brothers, to be brought into Joseph's home. And they thought about that money. And so they came near and they said to him, now, oh, by the way, there's been some sort of a mix-up here because when we opened our sacks when we got back home, we found our money that we paid for the food put back in our sacks. And we just want to get that straight with you so that you get what's yours. And it was the servant of Joseph in verse 23 who said something really interesting, didn't he? He said to the brothers, these very nervous brothers, "Peace be unto you. Fear not, your God and the God of your father hath given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money." Now that must have been very curious to them. They don't know what you know about that. Not yet. But they were reassuring words. And something else reassuring came when they found that Simeon didn't have his head cut off, that he was brought back to them. And then verse 24, the man brought them into Joseph's house and gave them water, and they washed their feet and gave the animals food. And they made ready the present. Remember, he was to bring a present? So they got the present ready, and they handed that over, and there's not a word said about how that was received. But again, verse 26 says that after they'd given the present, they bowed themselves to the earth. And Joseph then talks to them in verse 27. And he asked them of their welfare. "And is your father well, the old man of whom you spake? Is he yet alive?" Joseph asked about that. It's obvious why he would be interested. But he'll ask even again a little later. And they answer and say, "Yes, yes, thy servant, our father, is in good health. He is yet alive." And they bowed down their heads. Again, these dreams coming true. The father is described as the servant, and the brothers bow their heads and make obeisance. And then verse 29 is touching, isn't it? And Joseph lifted up his eyes, and he saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. I don't know exactly how old Benjamin was at this time, but he must have been quite young the last time Joseph saw him. Been 20-something years. And now he's a grown man, at least his early 20s. "Is this your younger brother of whom you spake to me?" Excuse me. And all he could get out was these words. He said, "God be gracious to thee, my son." That really touches you, doesn't it? Joseph made haste. He had to get somewhere. The emotions overcame him again, weeping there. Again, he washes his face. Verse 31, restrained himself, came back out. He's not ready yet to let them know who he is. And then he said, serve. So they began to serve. Now, it's interesting in verse 32, because we find there was a particular order here. Joseph was by himself, and the Egyptians ate by themselves, and then the brothers over here were by themselves. Because, the text tells us here, this is the latter part of verse 32, it's an abomination unto the Egyptians to eat with the Hebrews. Now, he doesn't explain that. I've tried to do some reading about that, and you may have too, and I've heard several guesses about that as to why. We find out later because they were shepherds. That was a factor in it. I've read several folks who have said that the ancient Egyptians were by and large vegetarians, and maybe they didn't like these meat eaters in their midst. They had some animals too that they might use for wool, or they might use for some other purpose, maybe milk or something like that. But maybe that was the reason. Or maybe it was just Egyptians sort of thought foreigners were lessers. Maybe that was the reason. Or I don't know exactly. He doesn't explain why. But there was a part of that looking down their nose at these folks, and so they could be kind to them, but they weren't that kind. So anyway, they're eating, but not together exactly. for the reason that's given there. Again, don't you see the providence of God in this? Because later on, when Pharaoh invites them to come in, they don't come in to assimilate and be a part of the Egyptian culture, do they? They're going to be there but separate, which was God's plan. The problem in Canaan was they were too familiar with the Canaanites. And you can see that in some of the behavior of these patriarchs. But God's providence, again, bring them down to a land not Canaan so that they will grow separately. All of this is in the mind of God and in the execution of His plan. Anyway, back in 43 now. Verse 33 tells us that one thing that just shocked them was that He had actually arranged that they would sit in birth order. How in the world did He know that? They had no idea. They might have thought some of that divination that we'll read about was a part of it. I don't know. He couldn't have guessed that. And they all received a portion, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times more than the rest. It's almost as if Joseph is trying to stoke jealousy, if there's any to be found there, isn't it? And I can't think of any reason why he would have done that, perhaps more. But they all seem to have a good time. And then in chapter 44, anybody question about 43, particularly a point you had there? I'm sorry, I wish we could take this at a different pace, but I don't want to miss it if you have. Yes, sir.
I may be wrong, but I think he gave Benjamin most because Benjamin was his mother's son.
Could have been. Certainly be a factor. But based on what will happen, of course, in the next chapter, it seems obvious that he's trying to set up Benjamin and see if some of those same old rivalries, jealousies, meanness is still there, or are these guys different people? I think that will determine how he's going to handle things. So, but I'm sure you're right. There was a defection there that was special. Well, chapter 44 deals with Joseph springing the trap, as it were, at least as I read it. He commanded the steward of the house. Everybody's having a good time. They get ready to go home. They've got the food. Everything seems to be going well. He says, I want you to fill the sacks of the men with food, as much as they can carry. And I want you to put their money back in. So now they've got 2 sacks of money. And I want you to put my cup in there, in one of those sacks. I want you to take my personal cup and I want you to put it in the mouth of the sack of the youngest. And of course they did as they were commanded. In the morning, as soon as it was light, the fellows got up, mounted the beast, and rode away, and I'm sure they thought, man, I have never been so glad to leave a place in my life. I thought we had a gun to our head the whole time we were there. I'm so glad we're going. And then they hadn't hardly got out of sight before Joseph said, go catch those fellows. And I want you to accuse them of stealing. And so they did. Joseph said, you tell them you have rewarded evil for good. Is not this it in which my Lord drinketh, and where indeed he divineth? Ye have done evil in so doing. Question comes up. What do you mean, divine? Of course, it was a drinking cup, but it was also used for divining. Divination. What's divination? Fortune telling by the occult means, I don't know, he doesn't explain how the cup would come into that. Something about how something was poured in there, looked, or whatever it might be. I'm sure there were plenty of folks like that in Egypt who would use various methods to divine the future, appealing to forces out there. Nobody in this room believes that's Joseph. I feel confident. I certainly don't. Joseph, over and over again, when Pharaoh would say, oh, you're the wise man, he'd say, no, God is the wise. And God is the one. So I don't believe that Joseph in any way was involved in that, though he brings it up later. He brings it up here. But I think he's still playing the Egyptian officer at this point. And so, that would have sounded very expected to talk about a man in Joseph's position having a cup to divine with or some such thing. So I think that's the way, at least I read it. Others have different ideas, but that's what makes the most sense to me. I don't think Joseph had stooped to divination. But I think Joseph had put an item in their bag that was valuable, that was special, and that certainly they couldn't have taken by accident. So he overtook them. The servant did, said exactly what Joseph told them to say. And the response of the brothers is expected. They have no idea about this. They say, God forbid. Behold, we brought the money back. You remember that? We were not thieves. We wouldn't have done that if we were thieves. And by the way, if you find that cup with any of us, let them die. And the rest of us will be your slaves. I don't know that the price, or generally for stealing, was death, but it was as far as they were concerned. And the servant said in verse 10, now let it be according to your words, at least part of it. He with whom it is found shall be my servant, and ye shall be blameless. So what do? They throw those sacks on the ground, and everybody opens up the sack. No cup, no cup, no cup. And they get to Benjamin's, and there it is. And it's the most shocking, horrifying thing. And verse 13 says they rent their clothes. And they put their stuff back up on the beast and went back into town. And when they came back before Joseph, Judah and his brethren, that's how he says it in verse 14, they fall down on the ground. And Joseph again is still playing the Egyptian nobleman. And he says, what deed is this that you have done? Do you not know that such a man as I can certainly divine? And then this great speech on Judah's part. Beginning in verse 16, Judah said, what shall we say unto my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how shall we clear ourselves? God hath found out the iniquity of thy servants. Let me pause there. What does he mean by that, you suppose? The iniquity of thy servants. Do you think Benjamin really nicked the cup? Yes, sir.
I think the guilt that God did this to them was punishment for what they did to Joseph.
That old cloud of guilt is just over them all the time. You know, if we don't have a clear conscience, we can't look in the mirror. We can't look up to God. We can't pray. We can't do anything. And every time something happens, we feel like, well, I had this coming. This is God punishing me. It's a miserable place to be. How different that is from Paul, who could be in jail and sing hymns, you know. So anyway, he says, God's found out the iniquity. We're your servants. We're your slaves. You got us. And Joseph said, no, that's not what's going to happen. God forbid that I should do so. But the man in whose hand the cup is found, he shall be servant. And the rest of you can go back in peace to your father. And I believe, if this had happened 20 years earlier, you'd have those fellows saying, well, that sounds good to me. Too bad for you, Benjamin. And get back home and say, well, Dad, couldn't help it. Sorry. We tried. Wasn't our fault. If they're those kind of fellows now that they were before, now you're going to find out. I think this is not accidental or coincidental. I think all of this has been formulated. And I think Joseph has now got the moment that will test these men. And Judah rises to the test. In verse 18, he came near and he said, O my Lord, talking to Joseph, let thy servant, I pray thee, speak a word in my Lord's ears, and let not thine anger burn against thy servant, for thou art even as Pharaoh. My Lord asked his servant, saying, have you a father or a brother? And we said, yes, we have a father. And there's one child left at home, the child of his old age. His brother is dead. Heavily ironic, isn't it? He was talking to that brother. He didn't know it. And he is left alone of his mother, and his father loves him. That fact was enough for them to want to kill Joseph in the cruelest ways. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something here, but don't you think as you read this story, as you read Judah's words, the idea that the Rachel and her children are still the favorites of the father. That never changed. What changed was their attitude about it and their acceptance of that fact. And how that before that made them resent the father perhaps and certainly hate the brother. But now it's different. His father loves him. And we told you, we can't bring him down here. He can't leave his father. But you said he has to come. So he came. And in verse 26, we said we cannot go down if our youngest brother be with us. I'm sorry, we cannot go down, he's talking to the father now, unless our younger brother be with us. And the father finally said, okay. And thy servant, my father, said to us, verse 27, you know that my wife bare me 2 sons. How many wives did he have? He talks about 1 wife and 2 sons. I don't know that he ever wanted polygamy, but he wound up with 4 wives and 12 sons. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but he says, I had my wife, singular, and my sons, 2 sons. The one surely is torn in pieces. And you want to take this one away from me, it'll put me in the grave in sorrow. Now, verse 30, he explains to Joseph, whom he doesn't yet recognize. He said, if you take this also from me, and mischief befall him, you shall bring down my gray hairs to the grave. Verse 30 is what I'm trying to get to. Now therefore, when I come to thy servant, my father, and the lad be not with us, seeing his life is bound up in the lad's life, it shall come to pass that when he sees the lad's not with us, he'll die. And that mattered to him. The favoritism, whatever you want to say, none of that. He loved his father. In verse 32, he said something else. I promised my father. I gave myself to become a surety, a guarantor for the lad's life and safety. I told him, if I don't bring him back, the blame is on me. So in verse 33, Judah says, I pray you, let thy servant, talking about himself, abide instead of the lad, a bondman to my Lord, and let the lad go up to his brethren. How shall I go to my father, face my father, without this boy? Wow. Doesn't that remind you of something? Verse 33. Was there a son of Judah who did that on a greatest scale? Let me stand in their place. Selfless love. These men are different men, and that's, I think, a point to be made. Please, let me hear from you about these stories. Someone have a point, question of disagreement or detail about any of these stories?
God sure can weave a story.
Wow. Joseph's story, as you know, as we know, has been held up as the great example of God's providence, about God working. I don't think God forced anybody to be evil. I don't think he forced anybody to be good, but he used all the decisions of all these different people in order to work out a plan, to bring about, what's the big picture here that maybe we haven't camped on as much? Bring the people down to Egypt. To keep them away from the Canaanites until the right time when Canaan could be taken and this population destroyed, when the iniquity of the Amorites is full. God is working on so many levels. You know, we admire great chess players because they can play a game 21 moves ahead or whatever it is, you know. But the great point the book of Job makes is, Job, you're not in any position to judge what I do because you just don't know what I know. You don't know what I know. And that's certainly true about me. I don't know what he knows. That's one of the lessons I'm sure you think about, and I do as we read these great stories. Somebody had their hand up. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
I would just think, one of the things I hope to take away from this is the character of Joseph. He's in a position where he can do so much. He can like, I'm going to get my, perfect. I can do what I want to now. But the fact that he can tell he respects God, loves God, and he's a perfect example in ways that we should learn from that.
No
How
question.
we deal with one another, how we deal with others. Leave this in the hands of God. Let me not, be the avenger. I'll take control of this. No. Let God do that. Let me do the best I can. And I just think we can learn so much.
Oh, yeah. That great quotation we've all looked at so many times, am I in the place of God? Isn't that the same point that Paul made in Romans 12? Avenge not yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. Exactly. Wish I could say I've always done that. I always ought to do it. Appreciate that. Somebody else have a point, question, thought? If I made you forget it, I'm sorry. I don't mean to. If you'll make a little note as we're going along, we'll come back to your point. Because yes, sir.
Just a note, just much further back. I mean, there's a lot of different notes
Yeah.
that I think are related to the main theme. That he helped Simeon. Simeon, who once as soon as he heard that Reuben had told him not to do anything to him, he would have been the oldest one. He would have been the one most in charge. He would have been thrown in jail
Yeah.
for that. And the other thing is, after all of this, can you imagine they're about to go back up to Jacob? Was Benjamin going to ask him? I thought you said he was dead.
Yeah, that's one thing that we're not told is, did they ever have that sit down? Did Joseph, or did they ever make that confession? At some point, I think surely somebody would have had to have let it, the story, but we don't have any reference to
I
that.
don't think Joseph would have done it.
Yeah, I don't think he would either. It's
I don't think Joseph would have done it.
just a question. How would that have come out? So we'll have to, some of the questions that I might come up with are not necessarily answered. So anyway, but I appreciate very much your kind attention. We'll take up